Joe retired from his executive editor position in 2001, was brought back and then retired again in 2003. And I too retired from the Times in 2003. At the time, it seems, Joe started to do a lot more writing, and I started to do a lot more reading. And a lot of reading of Joe. And so now I know him just a little bit. And none of these books were easy subjects, particularly the one in 2006, Omaha Blues, A Memory Loop, in which he looks into the life of his father, Rabbi Arthur Lelyveld, and looks into himself. And then came a book on Mahatma Gandhi, and now Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the man who was my first president, and who was sworn in for his fourth term exactly 72 years ago, come this Friday, the day of Trump's inauguration. Joe's book, His Final Battle, The Last Months of Franklin Roosevelt, has been described by the Wall Street Journal as a significant contribution to FDR scholarship. It's also been called an incisive portrait of this deliberately inscrutable man, a consummate leader to the very last. Also, let's not forget Joe's book in 1986, Move Your Shadow. The subject was South Africa, and Joe received the Pulitzer Prize for general nonfiction for the work. The last thing of Joe's that I read was the September 29th, 2016 article in the New York Review of Books. It was titled Hillary versus Donald, The Benefit of the Doubt. It's centered on Hillary's speech on the final night of the Democratic Convention, and then went over the two campaigns and the many doubts about Hillary, and it ended with this graph. Most voters who are appalled by her opponent will realize that they have no choice, as Mike Bloomberg argued, but to give her the benefit of the doubt. But on the basis of what we've seen so far in the biggest campaign of her life, the benefit of a persistent doubt will be something less than a mandate. In fact, it will be a lot less than a mandate. And in 2 days, we'll have Donald Trump as our president, but fortunately today, we have Joe Lelyveld as our speaker.
There are several reasons why it seems weirdly appropriate to be talking about my subject here today, the end of a presidency. That's happening this week. The meaning of the name of this society, which was explained to me just yesterday by Warren Hogue, and I do qualify as a fossil. Given that it's 15 years since I was last a daily newspaper man. But the third struck me as I was walking into this building, this splendid building. This was the home of Samuel J. Tilden. And if I'm not mistaken, he was the first president to win the popular vote, and not for the first candidate to win the popular vote and not the presidency. And so somewhere here I have my stump talk. I once got up and pulled a talk out of my pocket, and when I got to page 4, it wasn't there. I'd left it in the hotel room. And I had to somehow talk my way out of that. That was at Johnny Apple's memorial. And it was the most successful part of my talk. Because I said,
Get closer to the mic, Joe.
if I get closer, I'll swallow it. All right.
It helps if we point it at your mouth.
Okay. Now there's a man who knows. Okay. So I'll start off with a small confession here. I don't really have this will preclude questions later. I don't really have an answer to the question I'm most often asked about my book on Roosevelt. It's last month's. And that question is how I got to this subject in the first place. The awkward truth is I can't remember. That's an aspect of being a fossil. At some point, a little more than 4 years ago, after my previous book on Mahatma Gandhi came out, I read something that pointed me to this very different, not conspicuously spiritual figure. It wasn't a book, I know that, because I never read a book on Roosevelt. It may have been nothing more than a paragraph or a sentence in a review. Whatever it was, it started me thinking and poking around in libraries and eventually led me to the FDR library at Hyde Park, which had the added advantage, if I was going to launch myself into a project of this kind, of being being the right exit on the thruway, because I have a house on the other side of the river. But what drew me on, what I found myself wondering about, was the puzzle of Roosevelt's most intimate thoughts on the ultimate existential question, the question of his own mortality. What kept our longest-serving president going after all those years of stress in the midst of the most destructive war in human history? Was it his sense of duty or self-sacrifice? Or was he, as we sometimes now say on this sensitive topic, in denial? As it's fair to say most of us are, day in, day out. Not to be morbid, there was one fact in this connection I couldn't entirely ignore, and perhaps in this company I can admit to. I was already, when I started thinking about FDR, years older than he was at the end of his life. He was just 63 on the day he died, April 12th, 1945. I was old enough to remember that day. My 8th birthday had been the previous week. The way many of us remember November 22nd, 1963, and all of us remember September 11th, 2001. On that long-ago April day, my favorite radio serial, I'm pretty sure it was Captain Midnight, was interrupted by the fateful bulletin from Warm Springs, Georgia. This is how they did things in radio days, before the internet and social media. A deep, disembodied voice came out of a box. It said, "We interrupt this program to bring you an important news bulletin. President Roosevelt is dead," or words to that effect. These were followed by doleful orchestral music, then more bulletins. I kept waiting for Captain Midnight to come back. He didn't for several days. Could be my interest in this subject started there, but I don't really think so. I think I was doing eventually what I'd done through a long career as a reporter. I was looking for and sensing a story that hadn't been fully told. The time span I try to cover in my book is limited, just 17 months, as I finally conceived it, from the day Roosevelt left the White House in November 1943 to sail to the Mediterranean en route to Tehran to meet Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator, until that fatal day in Warm Springs. Obviously, those 17 months can't tell the whole story. It's necessary to bend the chronology forward and back to see a bigger picture. For instance, you can't fully understand Roosevelt's determination to engage Stalin face-to-face, as he did for the first time at Tehran, without referring back to his experiences as a second-tier official in the Woodrow Wilson administration during World War I, which left him with a determination this time around to shape the post-war order as he believed Wilson failed to do in his day. Even before Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt was preoccupied with the question of how this might be accomplished. He had no pat answer. He wasn't a man for pat answers. He didn't deal in them. But the question of how he could succeed where Wilson failed was never far from his mind. "I think I can personally handle Stalin better than either your Foreign Office or my State Department," he wrote to Churchill early on. Properly handled, the dictator might be the key to victory and the post-war world. It wasn't a sure thing, but it was a proposition to be tested. Tehran was to be the first test. Oops. Here we go, Apple time. Similarly, the chronology has to be bent, the backstory has to be filled in if we're to find meaning in the place he made in those last months in his crowded life for his old love, Lucy Mercer Rutherford. The drama inherent in the fact that she, not Eleanor, was with him when he was felled by a hemorrhage on the brain in Warm Springs. My 17 months are packed with huge events, history with a capital H, involving this president. The D-Day landings in Normandy, the largest amphibious assault ever and likely to remain so for all time. The decision to proceed with building the atomic bomb. FDR's long postponed decision to stand again for a fourth term in the election of 1944. His stealthy maneuvers to drop his starry-eyed vice president, Henry Wallace, from the ticket in favor, finally, of a little-known Missouri senator. A hard-fought campaign at a time when no other Democrat was given a chance of winning, soon followed by the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's big gamble on a counterattack in the Ardennes in Belgium, which proved to be virtually the last gasp of the Third Reich. Roosevelt's long trip to Yalta on the Black Sea for a second meeting with Stalin and Churchill, leading to an agreement on setting up the United Nations and to Soviet intervention on our side in the Pacific War, and crucially, a compromise on Poland that hardly stood a chance, he recognized at the time, since Stalin's Red Army had just completed the occupation of Poland, and that's to mention only a few highlights. And here's a sidelight. By picking Truman as his understudy, and earlier Dwight Eisenhower to be his supreme commander in Europe, both surprise choices in their day, FDR in effect chose not only his successor, but his successor's successor. All these matters have been written about at great length, over and over. It's amazing. I think there are 2 or 3 new Roosevelt books every month, which is a heart-stopping fact to engage when you're in the middle of one. All have given rise to controversies that still can't be deemed settled. But Roosevelt himself, I came to feel, as I did my homework, tends to recede in many of these accounts. He was too easily presumed long after the fact to have been a dying man, losing his grip on affairs in the midst of all the big events. After all, he did die. Yet somehow he managed to remain a convincing president almost to the end. His actual medical condition was never disclosed in his lifetime, and his medical records disappeared and were presumably destroyed afterwards. And I think that was his own posthumous hand had something to do with that. I think he probably had left instructions on that point. He took care, as he always had, to cover his tracks, and not just when it came to matters medical. This was the most private of public men, charming, loquacious, but also exceedingly guarded to the point of making our present-day candidates, think of Hillary Clinton or Daniel Trump, by contrast, fonts of self-revelation. He kept no diary, forbade the taking of minutes at his meetings, met the press regularly but almost always off the record. The very few who were later thought to have been his intimates and confidants got only peeks into his thinking, which was and this is, I think, the key point, the way his mind worked, which was in a constant state of flux and revision, never static, as situations and the political climate changed. Dedicated to keeping his political and diplomatic and personal options open as long as he could stand on all sides of an issue when it suited his purpose. Highly principled in his aims, he was routinely duplicitous in his tactics. A juggler, Roosevelt himself said, ready to lie if it would help win the war. The British military historian John Keegan called him by far the most enigmatic leading figure of World War II. I prefer the word inscrutable. It applies on the political home front too. In the same few days in July 1944, he simultaneously led a pair of would-be candidates for vice president to be his running mates, to believe that each had his support for the nomination, while working all the while to block them on behalf of a third man to whom he never directly spoke. Henry Wallace aptly called him a waterman, capable of looking in one direction while rowing in another. In these wartime months, his instinct for secretiveness could be justified on the basis of national security. Under a supposedly voluntary censorship with reporters covering the White House and their news organizations, the actual whereabouts of the president was treated as a state secret, not just when he traveled abroad to Tehran or Yalta or Casablanca, but also in the United States. The result was that he was away from the White House more than in it. Congress, the public at large, and cabinet members often didn't have the slightest idea of where he was. He made 21 trips of varying length to Hyde Park in those 17 months on a presidential train that departed secretly late at night from the basement of the Bureau of Engraving and Printing across the mall from the White House, riding in his own specially outfitted armor-plated railway car called the Ferdinand Magellan. And if any of you are fortunate enough to be heading to the Sunshine State, you might want to look in at the Gold Coast, Gold Coast Railway Museum outside the Miami Zoo, where the Ferdinand Magellan now sits in good condition. In April 1944, as D-Day approached, he spent a month in rehab at a plantation in the low country of coastal South Carolina. All that time, the closest the New York Times came to disclosing his whereabouts and condition was to say in a subordinate clause in an obscure inside story, not very long, that he was somewhere in the South. A line in David Herbert Donald's biography of Abraham Lincoln helped inspire me finally to give this elusive subject a shot. He said it had been his ambition to produce a biography written from Lincoln's point of view, using information and ideas available to him, seeking to explain rather than to judge. After some months of intermittent exploration, I concluded with a reporter's opportunism that there was ample room for such a book on Roosevelt, despite the many that had been written. The opening was there in part because some of his most industrious and best-known and brilliant biographers never got to the end of his life. Arthur Schlesinger's Age of Roosevelt was still in the 1930s after 3 volumes when it ended. Kenneth Davis died after his first 3 volumes. Frank Friedel, the earliest scholar to plan a multi-volume treatment, started a 5th but left it unfinished. Meanwhile, new information and insights surfaced over the years. There were the clinical notes Roosevelt's cardiologist, a New York specialist named Howard Bruin, eventually published in a medical journal 25 years after his patient died. There was a letter Frank Leahy, a noted surgeon, the founder of the eponymous Leahy Clinic in outside Boston, who was a consultant on Roosevelt's condition, left for posterity. A note dictated not by coincidence, I think, a day before FDR declared for a 4th term. It said he wouldn't be able to survive it. Much later, after a prolonged court battle over the issue of patient confidentiality, a fascinating case that went on for years with the National Archive on one side and the Leahy Clinic on the other, the Leahy letter finally came into the public domain in 2007. Most helpful were the Daisy Suckley diaries. Now, Daisy was a Hudson Valley neighbor and distant cousin who spent more time during the war years alone with the president than anyone else, including his wife. She then survived him by nearly a half-century, always insisting that she had no notes or correspondence, nothing like that. After she died in 1991, an old leather valise was hauled out from under her bed in her dilapidated mansion near Rhinebeck in Dutchess County. Inside was her diary, which Jeffrey Ward then edited into a volume aptly titled Closest Companion. Read in conjunction with the day-by-day White House logs, now online at the FDR Library's website, the Suckley diary supplies the mood music for the president's last months, a kind of up-and-down recitative in which his hopes, worries, and calculations find telling, highly valuable expression. These and similar late discoveries now made it possible to adapt Professor Donald's standard and attempt a book about this climactic period of his life and presidency, and the war, of course, from Roosevelt's point of view, to explain his thinking rather than judge him, in simplest terms, to tell a story. In reviewing the choices with which he was confronted through his eyes, it became clear to me they didn't really appear to him as choices. At the end of 1943, on his return from Tehran, he appeared to be in radiant good health, his crippling infirmity notwithstanding. 3 months later, his Navy cardiologist diagnosed him with congestive heart failure, a diagnosis that wasn't revealed for 25 years. Today, the condition he had could be easily treated, and he might have gotten 10 or 15 years more. But in those days, there was very little that could be done except to prescribe rest and changes in his diet and get him to knock off the Camel cigarettes. There were then only 2 months remaining to D-Day and 6 weeks to the Democratic Convention. Think about that. Our Constitution allows very little leeway, even with an amendment that then didn't exist on presidential disability. He was in a jam. At one time, he may have wondered whether an early end to the war in Europe might give him an opportunity to bow out. But that consummation didn't come soon enough. Given those interlocking timetables for the invasion and the convention, he was in no position to look for an exit or a successor. He couldn't conceivably say on the eve of D-Day, "I'm out of here." Carrying on was a more obvious choice than getting out. He told himself and a few others that he could always resign if it got to be too much. A couple of vignettes stick in my mind when I consider FDR's valor in these months. I say valor, you could say inertia, but that's a matter of interpretation. One is of a visit he paid in the hills above Honolulu to the wards of a naval hospital to which amputees, survivors of the assault on the island of Saipan, had just been delivered. Roosevelt, who never allowed himself to be photographed in public in his everyday normal conveyance, his wheelchair, specially designed wheelchair, had the Secret Service wheel him through those wards from bed to bed so the wounded airmen could draw courage from the example of a commander-in-chief who hadn't been able to take a step unassisted for nearly a quarter of a century. This was a kind of communion. The other image also involves the wheelchair. The day after he returned from Yalta, arriving at the Capitol to address Congress for what would prove to be the final time, he had himself wheeled down the aisle and transferred to an armchair from which he spoke in a seated position at the foot of the podium where he'd previously stood, saying without a hint of self-pity, "It makes it a lot easier not to have to carry 10 pounds of steel around on the bottom of my legs." This was the first and only public acknowledgement in those 12 presidential years of his infirmity. Frances Perkins, who knew him before he was president, and was the first woman to occupy a cabinet office, called it one more spiritual inner victory for him in his long adjustment. A staunchly anti-Roosevelt columnist in the New York Daily News named John O'Donnell, who was a nasty man but a hell of a writer, wrote that even his grimmest political foes were stirred by the crippled president's brisk allusion to what had previously been unmentionable. It reawakened, O'Donnell wrote, their honest appreciation of the undoubted personal courage and fighting heart of the man who was about to tell them what he had done in the name of the Republic. It blew away some of the fumes of personal bitterness. Applause swept the chamber from both sides of the aisle. I'll end with an obvious thought in this week. We don't hear such grace notes in our own era. January 20th will come and go without the likes of Mitch McConnell or Sean Hannity saying anything halfway decent about Barack Obama. Nothing of a surprise in that. Thank you. I knew it would be you.
We're not going to review your whole career here. I want to ask you, do you shed any light on Roosevelt's reluctance to bomb the rail lines into Auschwitz, or his feelings on the Jews and the Holocaust?
Well, I don't go into that deeply. I have a view of it. I think I'm not even sure that the issue reached his desk because it was settled by Stimson and Marshall in what was then called the War Department. But their view, and I think he would have had no problem with it, was that first of all, the logistics of such attacks were difficult because of the long flights involved, and would mean fewer attacks on the actual rail lines of Germany, and would endanger American air crews, and of course there's the problem with that prescription that when you bomb the rail lines, who are you going to kill? A lot of Jews would die. The answer to that argument is typically they would die anyway, but it's not a very satisfying way. And the Germans had shown, and were showing daily, that they were very good at repairing rail lines. They were sending British and the Americans were bombing German rail lines every night with hundreds of bombers, literally hundreds, and very difficult missions from which 50 or 60 planes would not return, in a night. And the next day when they flew over, the rail lines were working again. So it wasn't a solution for the problem in the view of the people running the war, and I think Roosevelt basically accepted their views. So I in the same month when that issue began to rise to the surface as a proposition, he issued his strongest and best statement on what was happening to the Jews in Europe. But by that time, it wasn't a terribly effective statement, and it proposed no action. And it was sort of released as a White House statement, not something you can find very stirring at this point in retrospect. But
Joe, getting back to his health, who were his closest associates in the White House in the final days, and what was their view of his health, and what did they do about it?
Well, he had this cardiologist, Dr. Bruin, traveling with him every day. Now, Dr. Bruin had a portable electrocardiogram machine that he brought with him, and Roosevelt was getting an EKG once or twice a day. But the people on his staff knew nothing of this. This was all extremely closely held. If I can digress slightly, I had a really interesting experience in connection with this. I have a cardiologist, and I asked him to read my pages on Roosevelt's condition, and read Dr. Bruin's eventual article in the medical journal published 25 years later against that, and tell me if I made any obvious mistakes. He wasn't an expert on Roosevelt or anything. Now, my guy works in a suite of offices on Park Avenue where 8 or 9 doctors are stationed, and it's not unlikely there are people in the room who will know which building I mean. And he asked one of the old, he's a relatively young man, asked one of the older doctors in the group whether he remembered the name Howard Bruin, Roosevelt's cardiologist. He said, yes, as a matter of fact, he used to work in these offices after he, and it said, also, as a matter of fact, now that I think of it, he occupied the rooms you now occupy. And then a few weeks later, this older senior doctor was retiring, and he was clearing out a closet. And he came upon something he had forgotten, which was a a wooden box about this size with a brass plate on it, and on the plate it said Howard G. Bruin. And inside was a portable EKG machine. And I think it's almost certain it's the right era that machine went to Yalta, to the Aleutian Islands, to Tehran, went everywhere that Roosevelt went in the last year and a half of his life. That doesn't answer your question, Mike, but...
No. Joe, just to follow up on that, what about his political advisors? Didn't they discern the fact that his health was failing?
Everyone saw that he had lost a lot of weight, but Roosevelt didn't really have political advisors at that point. There were Democratic Party bosses who saw him, but he was their necessary meal ticket. But I think it's quite clear that Roosevelt was calling the shots at this point. What could they advise him? Don't die? Get better? And it wasn't clear that it was a fatal. He had lost a lot of weight, but some days he looked good, some days he looked bad. It had a lot to do with how much sleep he had had the night before. He was supposed to sleep 12 hours a day. He was supposed to work at half his normal workload. Most days he succeeded in doing that, and people saw him, and he looked good, spoke well, was very much himself. On other days, people looked in on him, and he looked very scary and didn't seem to be in command of his thoughts. And on consecutive days, different people had different conclusions. You can find any testimony you want on what shape Roosevelt was in on a given day in early 1945. He looked lousy at Yalta, as many people have concluded from the photographs, but he was very effective there in the view of most historians who have studied the Yalta Conference closely, and was in command of American policy and in bed half the time, but when he got to the conference table, he knew what he wanted to do and wasn't taking a lot of advice from anyone. He was a remarkable performer.
Three potential candidates for vice president. Eventually, Harry Truman was selected. Why was the information and adequate briefings withheld from Truman prior to Roosevelt's?
That's the second most frequent question I've gotten. I don't think there's much of a mystery about that. First of all, if you think about the vice presidency itself and its evolution as an office, the vice president wasn't a statute. There was no National Security Council. The vice president had no statutory foreign affairs or military responsibilities. He was basically a creature of the Hill and of the Senate, and not, unless the president died, not very important. Roosevelt hadn't himself decided what to do about the bomb, or what to do about Stalin, for that matter, at the point that he died. It was always, for him, a situation that had to be watched and considered and reevaluated on a daily basis, but he hadn't gotten to the point of decision. He was a great procrastinator on big issues. Now, Harry Truman hardly saw the president. They were together in this short period in Washington of 21 days. They were in Washington simultaneously for only 21 days during Roosevelt's short fourth term, because mostly he was on his way to Yalta and on his way back. Roosevelt was. And they saw each other only 2 or 3 times in that period. I don't know that it crossed Roosevelt's mind to say anything, but what could he have said? We have this thing. Truman knew vaguely that the bomb existed, but he didn't have any detailed knowledge. What difference would the question I try to raise is, what difference would it have made? the decision hadn't been taken, inevitably it was of such consequence, it would have to be made, not by the previous president, but by the president who was actually in office at the time it was made, and that would be Truman. There was no bequest that Roosevelt could give him in March or April of '45 about what to do about the bomb in July after it's tested. And so in the end, the decision was made in an orderly fashion by Truman after consultation with the War Department, and what happened happened. There's no way of knowing what Roosevelt would have done, I think basically because Roosevelt himself didn't know what he was going to do.
The Times today writes rather self-consciously about itself and its plans for evolution over 2020 and plans for cutbacks, which includes, according to Dean Baquet, firing a bunch of editors, which, as an editor, is alarming to me. What is your view of the future of the Times? And
well, I think the Times is a national treasure, and I hope the future is bright. But I have no more clue to that than you do. I don't get briefed on any of these things, and the situation has changed so dramatically since I was last an editor and engaged some of these issues. And I'm so far from being a millennial reader of the New York Times that I mostly feel I don't know what to say when I come upon these documents. When I hear that the newspaper, what I think of as the newspaper, the old printed paper, is now going to be produced by a newspaper hub, within a newsroom dedicated to more important things, like the digital future of the paper. I can understand what's driving them, but I guess what I worry about, and this is not the primary issue on the serious commercial and financial issues facing the paper. What I worry about is the mission of the paper. If the mission of the paper is just to attract a large paying audience that will sustain the New York Times company, that's the highest goal. Then what about its responsibility to cover essential public institutions and policies? Some of them get left by the wayside if the readers don't happen to be terribly interested in them at the moment. And how do reporters working out of subject hubs how do reporters working out of subject hubs get deep enough into the workings of government and other agencies and to develop really useful sources? I think there are answers to all these things, but I think that document is brave and scary at the same time.
There was a commonly held view that Roosevelt sold out Eastern Europe during at the Yalta Conference. You just said that you felt it was effective.
Well, that all essentially turns on Poland. Nobody at the time suggested that we continue the war and go to war with the Soviet Union, which had basically won the war before we got into it, and to put it crudely, and Poland was completely occupied by the Red Army. So the people who make that argument don't really have a proposition as to what he could have or should have done. There were many issues at the time: future of the international organization, the unresolved Pacific War, and I think to have taken. I think I show that he worked hard on Poland, and I think it's very easy to say that in retrospect, but it's very difficult to show where he put a foot wrong. They could have. Another possibility would have been to bag the United Nations, forget about that, and all the hopes that now seem exaggerated, but which were at the time attached to it, and make the Polish issue the predominant issue of the day, end the Yalta Conference unsuccessfully, say that the Allies, who still hadn't conquered Germany, had a falling out on this issue, and that the war, in effect, would only be partially successful, and an era of peace was not likely in Europe. That would have been another way to go, but nobody really argued for it.
What do you think that New York Times could have done better in covering Donald Trump, or to put it another way, what were the most egregious shortcomings from your point of view? And then to do a follow-up that I normally don't do that's totally unrelated, taking from the current press practice. Were Donald Trump to read a book, what would be the most important thing he could learn from reading your book? But please answer the first question first.
I don't make it a business to kibitz and second guess the people running the Times. I admire them greatly. They have huge challenges. I don't make.
No, tilt it toward right in front of your face.
Okay. I really don't want to criticize the people calling the shots at the Times today. They're admirable people, great journalists. It's a terrific paper, and I think and they did some wonderful work on Trump. It wasn't going to matter in this post-fact era, but I think the only thing they could be faulted for, perhaps, was starting a little late and being guided too much by the universal assumption that probably shared by Donald Trump that he wasn't going to be a winner and that he didn't need to be taken seriously. But once they started, and they started before the Republican convention with real focus and vigor at the end of the Republican primaries, I think they did an excellent job. Others did an excellent job too, but But this was not an election that was going to be decided by press coverage.
What can you learn from your book? What's the most important lesson from your book?
About the way a successful president probably needs to think, and in order to be in command of events. The tweets don't quite do it.
Hi. You told us that FDR didn't see his choices as his decisions requiring choices. He didn't see choices, and yet you've also told us that he was a procrastinator. Can you elucidate between those two?
Well, yes, I think that's not so hard. Roosevelt took a long time. To him, timing was everything in politics, and he didn't take decisions until they were almost forced upon him. I mean, he waited. Look how long he waited to get into the war in Europe after 1939 and 1940, and we still didn't go to war until Hitler declared war on us after Pearl Harbor. So that's one example of his biding his time. And what he was doing there wasn't running away from a big decision. He was waiting for the sense that I think he had an extrasensory perception of when he had the country behind him. You can't easily go to war without the country behind you, and that's something he knew and understood.
Briefly, what was his relationship with Eleanor at this point, among others, as we know?
They had a great mutual respect. They had a fine working relationship, but he found her very trying. And it's amazing. I did a count on the basis of the White House log of how often they were in the same place. In the period I looked at, which was 520 or 40 days, husband and wife were in the same place, same city, 170, I think the number was. And on the majority of those days, they didn't take meals together. She was a very busy woman, and by the time she got to him and he was ready to listen to her, he was basically, he wanted to be amused, not lectured. And I think it's a very touching relationship, but it had evolved that way over a period of 25 years.
Could you describe your view of the Churchill relationship in Yalta with Stalin and the president?
Churchill relationship with Roosevelt soured to some degree, despite their great mutual respect and affection in this time I'm writing about, at the end of Roosevelt's life, because increasingly it became clear at the beginning of the war, Britain was it was the British Empire. It had huge fighting forces. In addition to the British fighting forces, they had the Commonwealth forces. A million Indians went to Europe to fight for Europe's freedom, and by the last year of the war, it was clear that we were the dominant power, and increasingly we were calling the shots, and just as Roosevelt was focused on the United Nations and the future of peacekeeping in the post-war world, Churchill was focused on how you hold the empire together at a time when it's obviously collapsing. How you restore it, because most of it had been occupied, or much of it had been occupied by the Japanese. And they were not on the same wavelength on those things, and it was increasingly evident in their correspondence. And on Poland, they were in the same place till after Yalta. But Churchill was willing to trade away portions of what the Poles consider Poland. What they considered Eastern Poland is now part of the Ukraine, and sooner than Roosevelt. And Churchill came back and reported to the House of Commons on the success of the Yalta Conference in terms much more optimistic than any Roosevelt ever used. But basically, Roosevelt was focused on Stalin at Yalta as he was at Tehran, and avoided big discussions with Churchill at the conference, because he was trying to see how much flexibility there was in the Soviet position on various issues, and that wasn't crystal clear until after Yalta.
Joe, just following on that, is there in any sense, revealing or accurate or record of Stalin's views of what was happening in these meetings and his assessment of Roosevelt? And finally, also, was Roosevelt an indispensable figure in winning World War II? Or can you think of other politicians who probably would have brought off the same thing?
One of Roosevelt's conspicuous failures is he hadn't groomed a successor. Most presidents don't, but he thought of the best successor would probably be Wendell Willkie, his opponent in 1940. But Wendell Willkie, who ran for president in 1944 and was eliminated in the first primary in Wisconsin, where he came in, I think, fifth in a field of four, withdrew from the race and wasn't a plausible person. Roosevelt had dreams of different people who could have taken his place. He thought often of Henry J. Kaiser, the West Coast industrialist, but nobody else was really thinking that way. Was he indispensable? Who knows what would have happened? Thomas Dewey could have become president in 1944. Roosevelt could have decided he wasn't strong enough to run, and he could have bowed out, and Dewey could have become president, and John Foster Dulles could have constructed the Marshall Plan. Who knows? But Roosevelt had dominated American politics to such a degree by that point that he was the only one probably capable of taking the biggest decisions, which he took quite blithely on his own.
2 days we're going to have a new president. What could we have learned from the example of FDR should, and this is not wishful thinking, but should the current president or a future president become as ill as FDR was, what could be done in the current period to deal with that?
Is it the 24th Amendment, I believe it is, deals with that, and there's a whole procedure of how you declare a president disabled now, which came into existence after Eisenhower's heart attack, you might get Mike Pence.
Well, there are some people who felt that in his final year or so, Ronald Reagan was not in full control of his faculties. Did you look into that at all?
No.
Okay, good note to end. Thank you, Joe.
Well, two final things. First of all, Joe is now an honorary member of the Silurians. And the second thing is, see you on February 15th when we have Brian Steltner of CNN. And again, reserve early. It's going to be a packed house. Thank you.